No one pays attention to grey hair and wrinkled hands until those hands close around a throat. I stood in the hallway and heard my daughter-in-law say they were leaving my 9-year-old granddaughter behind because I should handle her. They think I am frail and finished. They do not know I have spent 30 years preparing for a war they just started. My name is Evelyn Marek. I am 58 years old, and for the last 3 decades, I have convinced the world that I am nothing more than a polite widow who bakes cinnamon rolls and tends to her hydrangeas. It was a carefully constructed disguise that served me well until tonight. I stood in the shadowed hallway of the house my husband and I had bought 30 years ago, pressing my back against the wall. The oak floorboards were cold against my bare feet, but the chill running through my veins was far colder. I was listening to my son and his wife discuss the disposal of a human being. The voices drifting from the living room were clear. My daughter-in-law, Marissa Holt, had a voice that usually grated on my nerves like sandpaper, but tonight it was smooth, detached, and utterly terrifying. "We decided you handle her," she said. The sentence hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. She was not talking about returning a defective blender or rehoming a stray cat. She was talking about Lily, my granddaughter. The sweet, 9-year-old girl who was currently asleep in the guest room upstairs, clutching the worn teddy bear I had stitched for her when she was born. I held my breath, waiting for the objection. I waited for Caleb, my son, the boy I had raised to be kind and honorable, to slam his fist on the table. I waited for him to scream that they would never abandon his daughter. Instead, there was a pause, followed by Caleb's voice, sounding pathetic and resigned. "Are you sure she will not call the police?" Marissa laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Evelyn. She is weak. Caleb. She is lonely. She will take the brat because she has nothing else in her life. Lily is a burden we cannot afford right now, not with the move. We leave her on the porch with a note if we have to. Evelyn will fold. She always folds." I felt a physical blow to my chest, as if someone had swung a sledgehammer into my ribs. The exhaustion I had been fighting for years suddenly threatened to pull me under. Since my husband died, I had been the bedrock of this family. I had worked tirelessly as a manager at the Horizon Social Bureau, navigating complex bureaucratic systems and managing crisis cases that would break lesser people. I had paid off Caleb's student loans. I had funded their wedding. I had covered their rent when Caleb's third business venture failed. I had given everything, stripping pieces of myself away to keep them warm. And this was my repayment. They viewed my generosity as weakness. They saw my silence as submission. The betrayal from Marissa was expected. She had always looked at me with eyes that calculated my net worth rather than my worth as a person. But Caleb, my son, hearing him agree that his own daughter was a burden that would ruin their new start was a knife twisting in my gut. He was not just complicit. He was relieved to be rid of the responsibility. I wanted to burst into the room. I wanted to scream until my throat bled, to throw them out of my house and call every authority figure I knew. But the training from my years at the Bureau kicked in. Panic is the enemy of strategy. Emotion is the enemy of execution. If I confronted them now, they would lie. They would gaslight me. They would take Lily and disappear. And I might never see my granddaughter again until it was too late. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. I remained silent. I stood in the dark, tears streaming down my face, and I listened. I let them outline their cruelty. I let them detail how they would drive away at 4 in the morning. I let them discuss how they would cut contact. I absorbed every poisonous word, every selfish plan, and I locked it away in the deepest part of my mind. They thought Evelyn Marrick was a fragile old woman who would crumble under the weight of an abandoned child. They thought they were leaving a burden on my doorstep. They had no idea that by stripping away my hope, they had given me something far more dangerous. They had given me a target. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my cardigan. My hands, which had been trembling, went perfectly still. I would handle her, just as they asked. I would raise Lily to be strong and loved. But I would also handle them. And I would do it with the same efficiency I had used to dismantle corrupt systems in my past life. The war had begun in my living room, and they had no idea they had just armed the enemy. 10 years ago, if I walked into a boardroom at the Horizon Social Bureau, conversations stopped. I was not the silent ghost haunting the hallways of this house. I was a force of nature. I managed case files that would make a police officer weep. And I made decisions that altered the trajectories of entire bloodlines. I was respected. I was feared. It is a bitter irony that the skills I used to save strangers were the very ones I failed to use on my own flesh and blood until it was nearly too late. The only person who saw the remnants of that strong woman was Lily. My granddaughter was the only spark of light in a home that had grown steadily darker. While her parents saw me as an ATM machine with a pulse, Lily saw me as her sanctuary. We had our rituals. Sunday mornings were for kneading dough and whispering secrets that her parents were too self-absorbed to hear. She was the only one who looked me in the eye when she spoke. It was a bond that terrified Marissa. I watched the rot set in slowly. Caleb and Marissa had a wedding that cost me $40,000, a ceremony that promised a lifetime of partnership, but only delivered a partnership of greed. At first, I made excuses for them. When Caleb's first business venture in import-export collapsed, I wrote a check for $20,000 to keep him out of court. When Marissa claimed she needed a luxury vehicle to impress her real estate clients, I signed the lease. I told myself I was being a supportive mother. In reality, I was feeding a beast that would never be full. The fracture turned into a canyon 6 months ago. They cornered me in the very kitchen where I now sat in the dark. They presented a plan for me to sell my house, the house my husband and I had built brick by brick, so they could use the equity to pay off their mounting credit card debts. They called it downsizing. They said I was too old to manage the stairs. When I looked them in the eye and said no, the air in the room changed. I saw the mask slip from Marissa's face. She did not see a mother-in-law anymore. She saw an obstacle standing between her and a pile of money. That was when the cruelty turned toward Lily. I remember a Tuesday evening last month. Lily had come downstairs wearing a dress she had sewn herself, proud of her crooked stitches. Marissa did not smile. She looked at her daughter with a sneer that chilled my blood and told Lily she looked like a beggar. She told the child to go change before anyone saw her and embarrassed the family. I watched Lily's face crumble. I stood up to intervene. But Caleb caught my eye and shook his head, silently warning me not to start a fight. That was the moment I knew my son was gone. He had traded his spine for a quiet life with a monster. Since that night, I had felt a heavy dread settling in my gut. I spent hours sitting alone at the kitchen table after they had gone to bed, staring into the blackness of the backyard. I analyzed the silence in the house. I analyzed the way they stopped talking when I entered a room. My instincts, honed by decades of assessing dangerous social situations, screamed that something terrible was coming. I just never imagined the terrible thing would be them discarding their own child like a bag of trash. I sat there in the dark, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. I looked at my hands. They were older now, the skin thinner, but they were still steady. I had spent years mourning the family I thought I had. Now, the grief was gone, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. There was no one coming to save us. There was no father figure to step in, no social worker to file a report. There was only me. If I did not protect Lily, she would be devoured by their selfishness, and I would burn this whole house to the ground before I let that happen. The conversation in the living room shifted from a general discussion of their future into a detailed tactical breakdown of how to destroy mine. I stood frozen in the shadows of the hallway, listening as the vague threat I had heard earlier sharpened into a terrifying reality. They were not just planning to leave Lily behind. They were planning to erase her from their lives completely, like wiping a hard drive clean. Marissa was doing most of the talking. Her voice was steady and sickeningly pragmatic. She told Caleb that they simply could not take Lily with them because she was a liability. She said that Lily made them look tired and overwhelmed, and that in their new social circle, they needed to project an image of youth and freedom. She actually used the words brand management when referring to abandoning her own daughter. She said that a child with Lily's quiet, brooding demeanor would only drag them down. Caleb, to his credit, sounded nervous, but not for the right reasons. He asked what would happen if I called the police. He asked if they could get in trouble for child abandonment. He was not worried about Lily's safety. He was worried about his own criminal record. Marissa scoffed at his fear. She had a solution for that, too. She explained that they were moving to a different state, perhaps Texas or Florida, somewhere far away where nobody knew their history. She said they would change their phone numbers and delete their social media profiles. As for me, calling the police, she laughed. She told Caleb that no one would believe a grieving, lonely widow over two successful young professionals. She said they would paint me as confused and desperate for company. Then she said the words that made my blood run cold. She took a sip of what sounded like a glass of wine and said that Lily was damaged goods anyway. She said the girl was too strange, too watchful, and that there was something wrong with her that they did not have the time or money to fix. I felt a strange sensation wash over me. It was not sorrow anymore. It was a chemical shift in my brain, a survival mechanism I had not felt since my days investigating fraud rings at the bureau. My heart rate slowed down. My breathing became rhythmic. The panic evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. I was no longer a mother listening to her son. I was an operative listening to a target. The plan got worse. Caleb asked about the money, mentioning that they needed capital for the move. Marissa lowered her voice, but I could still hear every syllable. She proposed that before they left, they should file a petition to have me declared incompetent. She suggested they could claim I was showing signs of early-onset dementia. If they timed it right, they could freeze my bank accounts and gain power of attorney over my savings. She called it a necessary step to ensure I did not waste my money while they were gone. I looked down at my hand, resting on the doorframe. It was trembling violently, shaking so hard that my knuckles were white. But when I caught a glimpse of my face in the hallway mirror, my expression was stone. My eyes were dry and hard as steel. There was no love left in them. I realized in that moment that I had failed as a mother because I had raised a coward. Caleb was a weak man who would follow anyone who promised him an easy life. But Marissa was not weak. She was evil. She was a predator who viewed people as resources to be mined and discarded. I knew I could not wait. If I waited until morning, they might start the paperwork to freeze my assets. If I waited, they might take Lily somewhere I could not find her just to get her out of the way while they packed. I had to act immediately. I had to secure the two things they wanted to destroy: my granddaughter and my resources. I turned away from the living room, my bare feet silent on the wood, and headed toward the stairs. I was going to take Lily, and we were going to vanish before the sun came up. I moved up the stairs with a silence that would have unnerved my son had he been paying attention. My first stop was Lily's room. She was sound asleep, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm that broke my heart. I did not wake her. Instead, I grabbed her school backpack and emptied it. I worked with mechanical efficiency. 3 sets of clothes, her asthma inhaler, the small jewelry box I had given her for her 7th birthday. I packed only what was essential, treating this not as a vacation but as an extraction mission. Once her bag was hidden under the bed, I retreated to the bathroom and locked the door. I sat on the edge of the tub and dialed a number I had not called in months. Margot Hale answered on the 2nd ring. She was a retired lawyer with a reputation for being a shark in the courtroom, and she was the only person I trusted to understand the gravity of this situation. I kept my voice to a whisper. I told her everything. I told her about the conversation downstairs, the plan to abandon Lily, and the scheme to declare me incompetent. There was a long silence on the other end. Then, Margot spoke with a cold fury. She asked me if I was safe. I told her I was. She promised me that she would have the paperwork ready by morning to counter any filing they made. She told me to document everything. I hung up, feeling the first pillar of my defense fall into place. I slipped back into the hallway. I took my smartphone and set it to record. I placed it carefully on the floor near the air vent that connected to the living room. The voices of Caleb and Marissa were still drifting up, confident and cruel. Every word they spoke about fraud, about abandonment, about their disdain for their own family was now being captured. They were digging their own graves, sentence by sentence. Then came the most critical step. I went down to the basement, past the laundry machines, to the old storeroom at the back of the house. It was filled with dusty boxes of Christmas decorations and old coats, a place Caleb never bothered to enter. I pushed aside a heavy shelf of canned goods to reveal the wall behind it. There, hidden behind a loose panel of drywall, was a floor safe. My husband and I had installed it 20 years ago. Caleb thought I lived on a fixed pension. He thought I scraped by on Social Security and the small savings my husband left behind. He was wrong. I spun the dial. The heavy click of the lock opening was the most satisfying sound I had heard all night. Inside lay the reality of who I actually was. There were stacks of cash, roughly $50,000 in emergency funds that I kept for a crisis exactly like this one. There were bearer bonds and certificates of deposit worth over $500,000, accumulated through years of shrewd, quiet investing that I never discussed with anyone. But the money was not the most dangerous thing in that safe. I pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. Inside were documents I had kept from my days at the bureau, copies of old contracts, favors owed by powerful people, and, more importantly, a dossier I had started compiling on Marissa when she first started dating Caleb. I had never used it because I wanted to trust her. I wanted to be wrong. But looking at the papers now, I saw the history of a woman who had left a trail of deception wherever she went. I sat on the cold concrete floor and began to formulate a plan. I made a mental list of allies. I calculated travel times. I structured a plan to disappear from the map completely if their legal threats became immediate. I was not a helpless victim. I was a woman with resources, intelligence, and a righteous fury burning in her chest. I closed the safe and spun the dial, locking my arsenal away until the moment was right. They thought they were discarding a grandmother. They did not realize they had just declared war on a titan. They chose the wrong person to betray. The headlights swept across the living room curtains 2 hours earlier than I had anticipated. The gravel in the driveway crunched under the tires of their leased SUV, signaling that my window of opportunity had just slammed shut. I did not panic. Panic is a luxury for people who have safety nets, and I had none. I moved with the swift precision of a woman who had once led tactical drills. I woke Lily gently, placing a hand over her mouth before she could make a sound. I whispered that we were playing a game, a very serious game of hide-and-seek like we used to play when she was a toddler. I led her downstairs to the basement, past the furnace, to a section of the wall that looked like unfinished shelving. My late husband, a man who trusted banks about as much as he trusted politicians, had built a small, ventilated safe room behind the panels during the scare of the late 90s. It was tight, but it was secure. I settled Lily inside with a flashlight and a blanket, telling her not to make a sound until I came for her. I slid the panel back into place just as the front door upstairs creaked open. By the time I ascended the stairs and entered the kitchen, I had transformed. I hunched my shoulders forward, let my mouth hang slightly open, and allowed my hands to tremble visibly against the counter. I was no longer the strategist. I was the confused, overwhelmed grandmother they expected to see. Marissa stormed in first. She did not say hello. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning the corners as if she expected to find a police officer or a lawyer hiding behind the curtains. She walked right past me, marching into the hallway to peer into the living room. She was checking the perimeter. She wanted to make sure I had not called for help. Caleb followed her, looking pale and sweating despite the cool evening air. He refused to meet my eyes. He mumbled to me that he needed to pick up some files they had forgotten. I poured myself a glass of water, making sure to spill a little on the table to sell the performance of my frailty. Marissa circled back to the kitchen, her phone glowing in her hand. She was typing furiously, her thumbs moving with a manic speed. I watched her reflection in the darkened window above the sink. She was not texting a friend. Her face was tight with anxiety, and she kept glancing at the clock. She hid the screen the moment she felt my gaze, but I had seen the recipient's name briefly. It was not a name I recognized, but it was saved as priority loan. Caleb finally spoke. He cleared his throat and asked the question that had been hanging over us like a guillotine blade. He asked if I was prepared to take full custody of Lily. He used the words adopt and legal guardian, as if he were discussing a business transaction rather than his own daughter. He said it would be cleaner this way. I looked at him, letting my lower lip quiver. I told him I did not have a choice. I told him that I was old and tired, but I could not let the girl go to foster care. I played the martyr perfectly. I saw the tension leave Caleb's shoulders. He thought he had won. He thought I was submitting to his will. But then Marissa spoke, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. She looked at Caleb and snapped that he needed to get me to sign the papers immediately because the timeline was tight. She muttered under her breath that they could not afford any baggage showing up on the background check. That was the slip. Background check. People moving to a new state for a fresh start do not worry about background checks unless they are involved in something that requires high-level clearance or, more likely, a significant financial merger that required a clean audit of their personal lives. Then she said it. She turned to Caleb and hissed that if I did not sign the waiver by morning, the investors would pull the funding. My blood went cold. This was not just about moving. They were selling something. They were leveraging their lifestyle, and likely my assets, against a deal that hinged on them having zero dependents and zero liabilities. Lily was not just a burden. She was a deal-breaker for some illicit financial scheme they had cooked up. I gripped the edge of the counter to steady my hands, not out of act, but out of pure rage. They were trading a child for money. I looked at Marissa, who was now smirking at her phone, likely receiving confirmation that the trap was set. She had no idea that she was standing in a room with a woman who had dismantled criminal enterprises for a living. I realized then that merely escaping with Lily was not enough. I had to destroy them. Phase 2 of my plan could not wait until morning. It had to start now. Most people assume that a woman who spent 30 years managing social cases at a desk is defined by paperwork and patience. They do not know about the 3 years I spent in a specialized protective intelligence unit before I transitioned to administration. I was not just a bureaucrat. I was a trained observer. I learned how to track a target without being seen, how to analyze micro-expressions, and, most importantly, how to set psychological traps that force an enemy to reveal their own throat. While Caleb and Marissa were upstairs arguing about which moving company to hire, I was in the basement, not knitting, but monitoring the GPS tracker I had magnetically attached to the wheel well of their SUV 3 days ago. I had sensed the wind changing direction weeks ago, and old habits die hard. At 11 o'clock at night, Marissa slipped out of the house. She told Caleb she was going to the 24-hour pharmacy for a migraine. I watched the blue dot on my tablet move across the map, bypassing the pharmacy completely and heading toward an industrial park 5 miles east of town. I accessed the vehicle's internal microphone, a feature Caleb had set up for hands-free calling, which I had quietly paired to my own device months ago under the guise of tech support. Through my headphones, I heard the car door slam. Then, I heard another voice. It was male, rough, and terrified me more than any ghost story. He was not a lover. He was a collection agent. I listened as he demanded $150,000 by Friday. He mentioned gambling debts in Nevada and a failed Ponzi scheme Marissa had tried to run on her real estate clients. The picture became crystal clear. Marissa was not the successful agent she pretended to be. She was a fraudster drowning in debt, and she needed to liquidate my assets and dump her daughter to pay off a loan shark before he broke her legs. I recorded every second of the conversation. I compiled the audio file, cross-referenced it with the background check I had run on her maiden name, and sent the entire encrypted package to Margot. The legal case was now bulletproof. But I needed more than legal victory. I needed to break their alliance. I knew Caleb's banking information by heart. He was my son, and despite his betrayal, he was lazy with his security, using the same password he had used since high school. I logged into their joint savings account. I did not steal a penny. I simply transferred the entire balance, roughly $40,000, into a dormant sub-account that was invisible on the main dashboard, but legally still in their name. The next morning, the trap snapped shut. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee with a trembling hand, when Caleb checked his banking app. The color drained from his face so fast I thought he might faint. He screamed for Marissa. When he showed her the balance of 0, the explosion was instantaneous. Caleb accused Marissa of sending the money to her secret lover. Marissa, panicked by the debt she actually owed, accused Caleb of hiding the money to leave her behind. The veneer of their sophisticated partnership dissolved instantly. They were not a team. They were two parasites who realized the host was dry. And now they were turning on each other. I sat there, watching my son throw a coffee mug against the wall, shattering it into 100 pieces. I watched Marissa scream that he was a loser who could not provide for his family. They were ripping each other apart, exposing every resentment and lie they had buried for years. I lowered my head, pretending to weep at their fighting. But behind my hands, my eyes were dry. I was watching the demolition of their marriage, and I was the one holding the detonator. They had planned to destroy my life to save their own skins. But they forgot the first rule of engagement. Never start a war with someone who knows the terrain better than you do. The storm that had been brewing inside my house finally broke at 3 in the afternoon. Marissa returned first, slamming the front door with enough force to rattle the china in the cabinet. She marched into the kitchen where I was pretending to read a magazine, her face twisted into a mask of desperate fury. She threw a stack of legal documents onto the table. They were transfer papers for the deed to my house and a power of attorney granting her full control over my finances. "Sign them," she hissed. She told me that if I did not sign them within 5 minutes, she would have me committed to a state facility for the mentally unstable. She claimed she had already made the calls. I looked at her, making my hands shake violently as I reached for my reading glasses. I asked her why she was doing this. I kept my voice high and thin, playing the part of the terrified victim perfectly, all while the recorder in my pocket captured every single threat she spat at me. Then the plan fractured. The basement door creaked open. Lily, sensing the commotion, had crept up the stairs. She stood in the doorway, clutching her teddy bear, her eyes wide with fear. Marissa spun around, her eyes lit up with a cruel realization. She lunged for Lily, grabbing my 9-year-old granddaughter by the arm and yanking her into the room. She shouted that if I did not sign the papers, she would take Lily and I would never see her again. She said she would drop her off at a shelter in the next state. Something inside me snapped. The trembling in my hands vanished instantly. I stood up. My posture shifted from the slumped shoulders of a grandmother to the rigid readiness of a soldier. I looked Marissa in the eye and asked her if she really wanted to escalate this. I mentioned the name of the loan shark she owed money to. I asked her if he knew she was threatening a federal pensioner instead of paying him his cash. Marissa froze, her face draining of color. Panic made her sloppy. She released Lily and swung her hand at my face, a wild, desperate slap meant to assert dominance. She never made contact. 30 years of retirement does not erase muscle memory. I caught her wrist in midair. I stepped in close, using her own momentum against her, and twisted her arm behind her back in a standard joint lock. She screamed in pain as I forced her face down onto the kitchen table. It took less than 2 seconds. I held her there, applying just enough pressure to let her know I could break her arm if I chose to. The back door flew open. Caleb rushed in, his eyes wild. He saw his mother pinning his wife to the table. For a split second, I thought he would help me. I thought he would see the monster he had married. But cowardice is a powerful drug. He screamed at me to let her go. He shoved me hard, breaking my grip on Marissa. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not ask why his wife was attacking me. He pulled Marissa up and shouted that they were leaving now. Marissa, clutching her wrist, pointed at Lily. She told Caleb to grab the girl because they could use her as leverage to force me to wire the money later. Caleb hesitated, looking at his crying daughter. But he obeyed. He grabbed Lily, who was screaming for me, and dragged her out the back door toward the driveway. I did not chase them. I did not scream. I simply walked to the back porch and leaned against the railing, watching them shove my granddaughter into the back seat of the SUV. Caleb jumped into the driver's seat, his hands shaking so hard he dropped the keys twice. Marissa was screaming at him to start the car. Caleb jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. Silence. He tried again. Nothing. The engine did not even sputter. I watched panic overtake the cabin of the vehicle. Caleb slammed his hands against the steering wheel. Marissa shrieked, her face contorted with rage. They started blaming each other, their voices muffled by the glass, but their hatred visible. They did not know that 10 minutes before they arrived. I had opened the hood of their car and removed the starter relay fuse. I had also disconnected the negative terminal of the battery and hidden the cables. That car was nothing more than a 2-ton paperweight. Caleb looked out the window and saw me. I was not crying. I was not trembling. I was standing tall, staring him down with a look of absolute finality. I saw the realization hit him. He was trapped. His wife was a criminal. His mother was a warrior. And his escape route was dead. I spoke clearly across the yard, knowing they could read my lips. The game is over. The silence that followed the click of their dead engine was the sound of a guillotine blade falling, while Caleb and Marissa sat in their useless SUV, screaming into their phones for roadside assistance that would not come. I walked back inside and made the only call that mattered. I pressed send on an email to the county district attorney, copying the Child Protective Services regional director. Attached to that email were 4 gigabytes of audio recordings, financial records, and the video footage from the hidden camera in my kitchen capturing Marissa's assault on me. I did not scream. I did not fight. I did not. I simply pressed a button and let the legal system do the violence for me. Within 2 hours, Margot arrived with a court order signed by a judge she had known for 40 years. It was an emergency temporary protective order granting me sole custody of Lily pending a full investigation. When the police cruiser pulled into the driveway, Caleb looked relieved. He thought they were there to help him with his car. He realized his mistake only when the officer handed him the restraining order and told him he had 5 minutes to vacate the premises or be arrested for trespassing. The fallout was not a slow burn. It was a wildfire. By the next morning, the story had leaked. I had not gone to the press directly. But police reports in small towns have a way of finding the eyes of ambitious reporters. The headline on the local news website was brutal. It read, "Affluent couple. Investigated for attempting to abandon child with elderly relative." The article detailed the police report, which mentioned Marissa's threat to leave Lily at a shelter if I did not sign over my assets. The community reaction was swift and merciless. Caleb's phone began to ring, not with job offers, but with cancellations. His business partner, a man who valued reputation above profit, issued a public statement dissolving their partnership before noon on Tuesday. I watched from my living room window as Caleb stood on the sidewalk, pacing back and forth, staring at his phone as his entire professional network evaporated. Marissa fared far worse. The man she owed money to did not care about bad publicity, but he cared deeply about his investment. I saw a black sedan drive slowly past the house 3 times in 1 hour. Marissa saw it too. I watched her from behind my curtains as she shrank away from the window, her face a mask of absolute terror. She was trapped between the law and the lawless, and she had nowhere to run. Desperation makes people stupid. On Wednesday, Marissa tried to salvage her image by posting a long, tearful video on social media. She claimed I was a senile, abusive woman who had kidnapped her daughter and confused the police with dementia-fueled lies. She asked for prayers. It was a fatal miscalculation. Within 30 minutes, the internet had done its work. A neighbor who had filmed the driveway incident from her porch uploaded the video of Marissa screaming that Lily was damaged goods. The comment section on Marissa's post turned into a bloodbath. Thousands of strangers dissected her cruelty. They found her old real estate listings. They found the records of her failed businesses. She was not just exposed. She was incinerated by the court of public opinion. Thursday evening. Caleb came to my door. He looked 10 years older than he had just a week ago. He did not have his keys, so he had to knock like a stranger. He begged me to open the door. He spoke through the wood, his voice cracking. He said we could work this out. He said he could explain. He said that they were just stressed and that they never meant it. He asked for money, just enough to get them to a motel because their credit cards had been frozen. I stood on the other side of the door, my hand resting on the deadbolt. I could hear his breathing. I could hear the desperation of a man who realized he had thrown away the only person who had ever truly loved him. I thought about the little boy I used to walk to school. Then I thought about the man who watched his wife twist my arm and did nothing. I did not open the door. I did not speak. I walked away and went into the kitchen to make Lily a sandwich. Their life was falling like an elevator with a cut cable, screaming toward the basement. I was no longer their mother or their victim. I was the architect of their ruin. And I had not even played my final card yet. I sat with Lily, watching her color in a sketchbook, while outside, the world I had summoned continued to tear her parents apart, piece by piece. The end of my son's marriage did not happen with a whisper. It happened with a scream that shattered the peace of their rented townhouse and woke neighbors 3 blocks away. I was not there to witness it personally, but the police report Margot read to me later painted a vivid picture of the carnage. It was 10 o'clock at night when the patrol car pulled up to their curb. Caleb and Marissa were standing in their driveway, surrounded by half-packed boxes, screaming accusations at each other that were so loud they were audible from the street. Marissa was accusing Caleb of ruining her life with his incompetence. Caleb was screaming that she was a sociopath who had turned his own mother against him. When the officers approached, they did not stop. They were too consumed by their own panic and hatred to notice the uniforms until the handcuffs were already coming out. The police found more than just a domestic disturbance. In the back of their rental car, which they had somehow managed to jumpstart, officers found open suitcases filled with nothing but cash and jewelry. They found printouts of one-way bus tickets to a border town in Arizona. They found a distinct lack of children's clothing or toys. It was evidence of flight, clear and undeniable. When the officers asked where their daughter was, Marissa shouted that she was with her grandmother. When they asked why there was no plan for her return, neither of them had an answer. They were arrested on the spot. The charges were initial suspicion of child abandonment, disorderly conduct, and pending fraud investigations, but they were enough to hold them. The real destruction happened in the interrogation rooms. I was told they were placed in separate cells, and it took less than 20 minutes for the prisoner's dilemma to break them. Marissa cracked first. She told the detectives that the entire plan to abandon Lily was Caleb's idea. She claimed she was a victim of his coercion, a terrified wife forced to go along with a monster who hated his own child. She tried to paint herself as a hostage in her own marriage. Caleb, when informed of her statement, did not defend her. He exploded. He spilled everything. He told them about the loan sharks. He told them about the scheme to have me declared incompetent. He gave them the passwords to the accounts Marissa had been hiding. He detailed every fraudulent loan application and every illegal contract she had signed in his name. They tore each other apart with the ferocity of starving wolves, ensuring that neither would see the light of day for a very long time. While they were destroying each other, I was ensuring the safety of the innocent. Margot had taken Lily to her farmhouse for the night, far away from the sirens and the shouting. She told Lily that her parents were going away for a long time to get help. It was a kindness, a soft lie to cover a hard truth. I stayed behind in my kitchen, the nerve center of my operation. My phone rang at midnight. The screen lit up with Caleb's name. It was his one phone call from the county jail. I stared at the glowing screen, remembering the boy who used to cry when he scraped his knee, looking for me to make it better. That boy was dead. The man calling me was a stranger who had been willing to throw his own child into the garbage to save himself. I did not answer. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. I sat in the silence of my kitchen, the same room where they had plotted my demise just 48 hours earlier. On the table in front of me lay the final dossier. It contained the custody petition, the restraining orders, and the financial records proving their intent to defraud. It was a masterpiece of documentation. I ran my hand over the cool paper. I had not just survived, I had won. The house was quiet, but it was no longer the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of a fortress that had successfully repelled an invasion. The war was effectively over, but I still had to deliver the final execution in the courtroom. I turned off the kitchen light and sat in the dark, ready for the sun to rise on their judgment day. The courtroom was heavy with the scent of floor wax and old mahogany, a smell that usually intimidated people. But as I walked down the center aisle, I did not feel intimidated. I felt like a general surveying a battlefield I had already won. I wore my navy blue suit, the one I used to wear for board meetings, and I held my head high. At the defendant's table, Caleb and Marissa sat huddled together. Though not out of love, they were huddled in fear. They looked small, pale, and exhausted, stripping away the arrogance they had worn like armor just a week ago. Marissa tried to play the part of the grieving mother. She had clearly practiced her expression in the mirror, scrunching her face into a mask of sorrow, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue. When the judge asked her to speak, she choked out a rehearsed speech about how stress had clouded her judgment and how she only wanted what was best for her family. Caleb was even worse. He looked at me with pleading eyes, begging silently for me to save him one last time. He mumbled to the judge that he was a good man who had made a mistake, that he just needed a second chance to fix things. Then, it was my turn. I did not plead. I did not cry. I simply nodded to Margot. We presented the evidence with the precision of a surgical strike. First came the audio recordings of them calling Lily damaged goods and discussing how to abandon her. The courtroom went deathly silent as Marissa's voice filled the air, cold and calculating. Then came the financial records showing the fraud, the loans, and the attempt to seize my assets. Finally, we played the video from my kitchen. The judge, a stern man in his 60s, watched in visible disgust as Marissa twisted the arm of a senior citizen while my son watched and did nothing. The air left the room. Marissa sank into her chair, realizing her performance had crumbled. But the final blow was not digital. It was human. The bailiff opened the side door, and a court advocate walked in with Lily. My granddaughter did not look at her parents. She did not even acknowledge their existence. She saw me, and she broke into a run, burying her face in my coat. I wrapped my arms around her, glaring at Caleb and Marissa over her small head. That image, the child running to her grandmother for safety from her own parents, was more damning than any document. The gavel came down like a thunderclap. The judge stripped Caleb and Marissa of all parental rights effective immediately. He granted me full, permanent custody of Lily. But he did not stop there. Because of the severity of the fraud and the clear intent to endanger a minor, the criminal sentencing was harsh. Marissa, identified as the mastermind, was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy. Caleb, for his complicity and his own financial crimes, received 2 years. As the bailiffs handcuffed them, Marissa screamed. She screamed that it wasn't fair, that I had tricked them. Caleb just wept, looking at me one last time as he was led away. I did not look back. The fallout was total. Their names were splashed across the papers, not as the socialites they wanted to be, but as cautionary tales. Their friends vanished. Their careers were incinerated. They were left with nothing but time to think about the mother they betrayed and the daughter they threw away. 3 months later. The ocean breeze is the first thing I smell when I wake up. Lily and I moved to a quiet coastal town 400 miles away. We used the money I had saved and a little bit of the investment returns to open a small bakery called the Cinnamon Roll. Lily helps me frost the cakes after school. She laughs now. She has friends. The shadows under her eyes are gone. I sit on the porch in the evenings, listening to the waves crash against the shore. I am at peace, but I am not complacent. In the floor safe of our new home, buried beneath the deed to the bakery, I keep a thick manila envelope. It contains copies of every court order, every confession, and a few extra pieces of leverage I never had to use. I do not think they will ever come back. But if they do, I won't be the sweet old lady baking cookies. I will be the woman who took them down once and won't hesitate to do it again. Peace, after all, is only real when you have the ammunition to defend it. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop your city or country in the comments below. I read every single one of them to see how far our voice reaches. If you enjoyed seeing justice served, please hit that subscribe button for Grandma's Family Diary, like this video, and smash that hype button to help this story reach more people. Stay safe, and remember to always protect your own.